Hey everybody, Will here. Thanks again for signing up for the free training. You are going to learn some awesome stuff about tennis strategy over the course of the next couple of videos. You're going to love it, and simply by sitting at your computer and watching these videos, you're going to become a better tennis player. I mean, that is how powerful strategy can be. If you implement the right strategies and tactics, you're just going to become a much better player. Now, you might be wondering, why am I keeping my voice down a little bit? Well, I want to show you something pretty cool. Let's come over here. And when you talk about strategy, there's nobody better on tour at strategy than this guy right here, Roger Federer. And if you're wondering, how am I able to get up on a fence and film Roger Federer? Well, we are actually credentialed media at the BNP Paribas Open. That's where we are right now. So we're able to get access to guys like Federer, all the top players on tour, and just shoot some unbelievable video. And we're going to show you a little bit of that later on in this series. Not only are we going to talk about strategy, let's come over here. I don't want to, disturb Roger. We're going to teach you a lot about strategy, but we're also going to show you some of the behind-the-scenes stuff we do at FYB to bring you the best tennis instruction online. Okay, so we've taken a couple steps back from the practice court. You can see Federer is playing Wawrinka in a practice match. We don't want to disturb them as I tell you a little bit about this strategy course. Now, before we get to the meat and potatoes, I want to just point out this field here. We're going to show you some cool behind-the-scenes stuff from this tournament, some things you've never seen before, and this field is part of that. We're going to get to it a little bit later on. And right now, let's focus on the strategy portion and what specifically are you going to learn from these 4 free videos we're going to give you. Now, the thing that separates the top pros on tour and the top players from everybody else is strategy. Now, all these top players have awesome technique. They all swing the racket beautifully, and they all can hit huge shots. You got a guy like Roddick who's got a massive serve. Well, that serve by itself is not going to win him a match. Or Federer's forehand, that forehand is not going to win him a match. Or Djokovic's two-handed backhand. The reason these guys win matches is because they know how to construct points. They understand the strategy, and they know what tactics to use based on the matchup, based on what their opponent is good and bad at. But the interesting thing is, that's sort of the polar opposite approach of what most rec players take. Most rec players, they're entirely focused on technique. I mean, think about the last lesson you took. It probably was entirely focused on swinging the tennis racket and not focused on where do you put the tennis ball. And we've seen that at FYB. We're out here filming some of the, filming all the top pros, and we upload that footage to YouTube. If you've followed FYB for a while, you've probably seen that stuff. Our YouTube channel has something like 26 million plays. But the videos with the most views tend to focus on technique. It's either a clip of Federer hitting a forehand, backhand, Rafa. There's a video of me analyzing Federer's grip. Literally, how does he hold the tennis racket when he hits a forehand? That video has close to 900,000 plays. Again, they're all focused on technique. So what we wanted to do is focus this course entirely on strategy because it's so powerful. And after you get through this series of free videos, you are going to be a much better tennis player because strategy only takes understanding. It doesn't take years of figuring out how to swing a racket and developing that timing. It just takes understanding. So after these 4 videos, you are going to know how to construct points, and that immediately is going to make you a better player. So I think you're really going to love this stuff because it's rare that you get some content that can just make you improve in a short period of time. Okay, so we're going to do one of those behind-the-scenes segments we told you about. And we are on this field here, and this is where the pros come to loosen up, to kind of get warmed up before their matches. So if we take a look at the field, you actually have Caroline Wozniacki, I guess, walking out to a practice session right now. And right there you've got Juan Martín del Potro coming off. He was just hitting. We actually were just filming him down on one of the practice courts. Over there, you've got Milos Raonic. I believe I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's one of those up-and-coming players who's got just a monstrous serve. And over there, you've got Jo-Wilfried Tsonga kind of loosening up before one of his matches. Behind him, in the white shirt on the right, is Gilles Simon, a fellow Frenchman. If we pan over here, actually, you've got Jelena Jankovic walking out to a practice session ahead of one of her matches. And then you just got some kind of soccer nets here, and it's pretty cool. The players will just play soccer when they're kind of trying to just sort of unwind. The other day you had Novak Djokovic and Andy Murray on the same team playing just a pickup game of soccer, so that was a pretty cool thing to see. But I wanted to show you this area because it's one of those things you typically don't see at a tennis tournament. And that's one of the great things about the BNP Paribas Open in particular, this field here where you just can check out all the players going through their routines before they get loosened up. But it's also just one of those things you don't typically see on a network broadcast of a tournament. So we wanted to take a quick minute to show you. Okay, so that was a quick little, sneak peek behind the scenes segment. We're going to have more of that stuff coming up in this series. But now let's come back to the lessons, and I'm going to head back to FYB Studio in Washington, D.C. and get going with today's lesson. So thanks to the magic of video editing, we are back in FYB Studio, and we're going to run through 3 concepts right now: court geometry, directionals, and court positioning. And once we understand these 3 concepts, they are going to feed into the more complex stuff we're going to talk about in this video and then in the rest of this series. So we're going to start with court geometry. And we're not going to get too fancy with the math here. What's important to understand is that the tennis court is a rectangle. The distance cross court is greater than the distance down the line. The net is lower in the middle than it is by the single sidelines. And the reason that's important is because based on the dimensions of the tennis court, not all shots are created equal. And this is something a lot of rec players don't necessarily think about. The cross-court shot is safer. There is more court to hit into. You can hit a little bit longer. The ball is going to be in versus going down the line. And the net is lower, so the net is less of an obstacle going cross-court than it is if you hit down the line. So again, the key concept there, not all shots created equal. Cross-court is safer than down the line. So if you're making a lot of errors down the line, one of the reasons is, there's not as much court to work with and you've got a higher obstacle with the net. Now the second concept is something called directionals. And this is a term coined by Paul Wardlaw to describe high percentage and low percentage shots, because based on how the ball is coming into you, based on how your opponent and how it's actually traveling towards you, some shots are going to be easier to hit than other shots. And before we go any further, we've got this player icon here. And, the circle's the player, the stick's the side they're hitting on. This is a forehand for a righty, a backhand for a righty. That doesn't really matter actually too much in terms of this discussion. But what we're going to do is put the player over here. We're going to say he's hitting a forehand. And we're going to draw a line. This line would travel straight down the court through the plane of the player. And Wardlaw talked about something called inside and outside ground strokes. And the key concept is that the inside ground strokes are better. They're preferable to the outside ground strokes. And the reason is because the inside ground strokes are easier to control. In other words, we can do more with those inside ground strokes. So let's specifically define what an outside ground stroke is, what an inside ground stroke is. We'll start with an outside ground stroke. And simply put, an outside ground stroke is where the ball is going to cross the plane of your body and be moving away from you when you hit it. So in other words, got my handy dandy foam ball. If I am hitting a backhand, I'm a lefty, so if the ball comes this way and crosses the plane of my body like that, so I hit it when it's moving away from me, that's an outside ground stroke. So again, those ones are a little tougher to control than those inside ground strokes. We'll get to that in a second. My foam ball is rolling away from me. The inside ground strokes are where you've got, let's go over here now. We'll say we're hitting a backhand where the ball doesn't cross the plane of the body and it's coming into you when you hit it. So let me grab my foam ball. So now if the ball is coming this way, and it would come into my forehand now, so again I'm a lefty, if it comes this way towards me, hasn't crossed the plane of my body, and I hit it, that's the inside ground stroke we're talking about. And again, that ball is preferable. And the reason it's preferable is because it's coming into me. I have more leverage over it when I hit it. You can see I'm taking a baseball swing. We're getting to that analogy in 1 second. I have more leverage over the ball because it's coming into me. Some coaches describing this as being able to pull the ball. So that allows me to do more with it. Could be a tennis ball, could be a baseball. Again, you saw me shadowing that swing. The simple example is right-handed batters hit most of their home runs to left field. And that's because, and they do it on those inside pitches where they have more leverage, they can pull the ball and hit it into left field. And when you pitch away from them, that makes it more difficult to get leverage over the ball, certainly more difficult to hit home runs. But it's that leverage and pulling the ball. That's why you get the home runs to left field, not so many to right field for a right-handed batter. For a left-handed batter, it's the opposite. Most home runs go to right field, not too many to left field. And if you're a big baseball buff, you know that based on this dynamic, the defense is going to shift around, based on whether you have a right-handed or left-handed batter. So, you can certainly go look that up on Wikipedia or Google if you want some more information. But the reason this stuff's important is because you want to be able to identify when you're in a rally, do I have an outside ground stroke or an inside ground stroke? Don't need the foam ball anymore. So let's construct a forehand-to-forehand cross-court rally. So we've got an exchange like this. Outside ground strokes right now, again, because the ball is crossing the plane of the player's body and moving away at contact. So in situations like this, the higher percentage play based on the directionals and based on the fact that we have less leverage is to send the ball back where it came from. And a trickier play is to take that ball down the line. That's lower percentage. It's harder to control those balls. And if we add in the court geometry we just talked about, we also have the court working against us and the net working against us as well. So the down the line shot is a trickier one to pull off. More likely to make a mistake than you are to just send the ball back cross court. Now, if we modify this slightly, and we'll draw this line again, but we'll say plane of the body here, and then plane of the body here. So now we've got an outside ground stroke for the player down here. The ball crosses the plane. He sends it cross court. But this ball is no longer crossing this player's plane. It's coming into him. This would be a backhand in this instance for this player. But because it's an inside ground stroke, this player has more leverage, more control over the ball. So this would be a better time if this player decided to change the direction of the ball. So the sort of macro concept here is in a cross-court exchange like that, because you have outside ground strokes, you really need a good reason to go down the line. Most of those outside ground strokes in a cross-court rally should go back cross-court, higher percentage play. And, if you're wondering when is a good time for me to take an outside ground stroke down the line, it would be when you get a short ball. This would be on the forehand side. You get a short ball, doesn't have quite as much juice, so it's easier for you to control. Then that would be a time to go down the line. But again, the moral of the story is you really need a good reason to change direction on those outside ground strokes. And just generally the concept you want to walk away this particular discussion with is that outside ground strokes, not as good as inside ground strokes. Inside ground strokes are the ones we really like because we have more leverage, easier to control, easier to do more with that tennis ball. So the last thing we want to do is talk about court positioning. Where do you want to stand on the court during a rally? And I've got 3 points up here, 3 points down here. These are your court positioning points. Now, the key with court positioning is that you want to position yourself in between the max angles that your opponent can generate based on where they are hitting the ball on the tennis court. So in other words, if you've got your opponent and he's smack dab in the middle of the court, the maximum angles he can generate are going to be equal, more or less, on both ends of the court. And because of that, you want to position yourself in the middle of the court as well. Again, that'll put you right in the middle of those max angles. But if we've got your opponent on one side or the other, let's say that he's hitting a forehand over here, suddenly the angles to this area of the court aren't as great. He can't pull you off the court as much, but over here he has a little bit better of an angle to work with. So it might look something like this. And because of that, now you actually want to position yourself about right here on this positioning point. That will put you in between the max angles that your opponent can generate. Now, it's also worth noting that if you get in a cross-court rally like this, like we just talked about in that previous segment, the down the line isn't quite as likely simply because it's a lower percentage shot. If you're hitting a quality ball, hitting a ball, your opponent hitting a ball, putting the ball right on a dime in the corner, it's pretty unlikely. So you don't have to worry about that too much, and you should really anticipate the cross-court shot more often. But the court positioning point over here on the right-hand side is where you want to be. This is a couple feet to the right of the tee when your opponent is making contact on this end of the court. And of course, you can see that when your opponent is over here somewhere, the correct positioning point is going to be over there to cut off. You take this and then you reverse it. So you have the max angle now being off the court this way, and then the down the line, he can't pull you nearly as far off the court. So again, this is the correct positioning point. And if you're hitting the ball somewhere over here, your opponent's going to recover there. So we can just walk through a couple quick examples to make this very clear. So if you're rallying down the middle, then you're going to position yourself in the middle. If you hit a ball over here, when your opponent is waiting for the ball, he's going to be on this positioning point. And let's say you hit the ball cross court and your opponent goes over there to hit it. You're going to come there to that positioning point. Let's say your opponent makes contact over there. You're going to position yourself at this point. If he goes cross court and hits and you hit over here, he's going to come to this point, and so on. So you can see how all of that works. Now the final thing we want to understand is that you also want to be mindful of vertical court positioning. The further you move into the court, the further in you hit the ball, the more of an advantage you have. And the reason for that is because the angles open up. If you hit the ball, well, let's say your opponent hits the ball really far back, so we're just going to put him out of the camera's view. He can't really generate any angles. The ball is going to travel through the court as opposed to off the court. But if your opponent is now here, let's say right up at the service line, he can now go off the court much more effectively. So you can see that the further someone gets into the court, the more you have to worry about in terms of what you have to cover. Again, because the angles open up, your opponent can pull you off the court further, so you are now at a disadvantage from a court positioning standpoint. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but we want to make sure that you understand this concept. It's not just the the horizontal positioning we need to be aware of. It's also the vertical positioning. So now we got SWAT, and we've got a lot of craziness going on the board here. We're going to focus on this area to start. I'll obviously explain everything else. And SWAT is a business term we have applied to tennis. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The strengths are what you are good at, maybe your forehand. That tends to be a very typical strength for a rec player. You got the weaknesses. Backhand tends to be the weaker side for a rec player. Opportunities is what your opponent is weak at, and threats is what your opponent is good at, your opponent's strengths. So we don't just want this broad understanding of SWAT. In other words, we don't just want to say, my forehand is my strength, and leave it at that. What we're really looking for is the why. Why specifically is your forehand a strength? Why specifically is your backhand a strength? So maybe your forehand's a strength because you can hit it with good pace and it really pressures your opponent. Or maybe your forehand's a strength because it's very consistent and it's got heavy topspin and you move it around the court well. Why is your backhand a weakness? Maybe you don't hit it very well on the run. Maybe it breaks down easily, and so on. And again, what is key is you don't just do this analysis on yourself. You do it on your opponent over the course of a match. And most rec players are just stuck right here. They only do this, and they don't realize what's going on the other end of the court. They don't realize what their opponent is doing to them. So that's a very, very common mistake. But when you get all of this together, then you get this matchup over here. So the matchup is key, and this big mistake we want to avoid is, you've got your strengths and you've got your weaknesses. This is sort of in a vacuum right now. When you get this matchup, your strengths and your weaknesses can change. So let's see exactly how that works. We've got two, we got Fed versus Roddick, we got Fed versus Nadal. So Federer's backhand slice, for example. Against Roddick, that is most definitely a strength. Just the backhand exchange for Federer is a winning proposition for him. He's going to go topspin, he's going to go slice. His backhand is better than Roddick's backhand. So that would be a strength for Federer to an opportunity, a weakness for Roddick. And of course, Fed will get into that exchange any day of the week with Roddick. He knows he's going to win most of those points. Well, you take Fed's backhand, exact same backhand. Now you got Federer versus Rafa. Now this is very much a weakness for Federer now. And the reason it's a weakness is based on the matchup again. Rafa's forehand, that lefty forehand, doesn't have any problem with Federer's topspin, doesn't have any problem with Federer's slice. You know, that slice stays low, tricky for Roddick to handle. Rafa's got so much topspin, no problem. He eats that thing up. So the matchup is going to change this dynamic over here. And again, that's the big mistake you want to avoid. The big mistake almost every single rec player makes is they come into a match saying, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm not good at, this is what I don't like, and then that calculus doesn't change at all. Even if their opponent is breaking them down somehow, or even if there's a matchup that might be preferable but is a little bit out of the comfort zone for the rec player or what they're typically used to doing, the way they're used to constructing points. So let me make one final point to round out this segment. And it has to do with this big mistake here, because this big mistake, not just rec players who make it, it's players at all levels of the game up to the Pro Tour. But the key here is we really have to understand SWAT and understand how it applies to our games, how the matchups can change. If you don't understand that and you're not thinking in this way, then you're not going to improve. So the key to improving is to get that matchups are really what drive how you want to structure your game plan. We'll get a little bit more into that in the next video. I'm about to touch on that. But I want to come back to this example of Fed versus Nadal, because we have to look no further than Fed Nadal to see the truth in this concept. Because, like I said before, the backhand-to-backhand exchange works great for Fed against Roddick. And earlier in Federer's career, well, Fed thought he could go his backhand to Rafa's forehand no problem because, heck, that exchange worked against literally every single other player out there. Righties, lefties, it didn't matter. But, with Rafa, like we said before, that topspin, that changed, or rather the topspin really allowed Rafa to take advantage of that backhand. Fed didn't realize that initially. He kept going with that slice, topspin, alternating, keeping it cross court, and try as he might, it wasn't effective. So we've seen more recently, Fed has started to change his tactics a little bit because he realized, well, this was a losing proposition for him. What initially was a strength now was a weakness compared to Rafa's forehand. In other words, as we're about to see with this big mistake here, it feeds into DNO. The backhand to forehand exchange, defensive situation for Federer. So he's now started to get away from that. And we're going to touch on DNO in the next video. Stands for defense neutral offense. Very, very cool concept. Very key to understand. So I'm gonna stop talking about it here. We'll get to it in the next video. But I will close by saying that we are going to use DNO to construct a winning strategy against a pusher, because everybody hates a pusher, right? So we're gonna talk about how we can use a little SWAT feeding into DNO to come up with a winning game plan against that hated opponent. So stay tuned for that. All right, so we're back at the BNP Paribas Open. The day is winding down. We're overlooking the facilities right now. Got the practice courts over here. Over there is the field where the players go to warm up and get loose. And then we have this dramatic background over here with the mountains and the sunset. Very beautiful tournament. You need to make it out here at least once because it's just awesome. Now, we had a very productive day at FYB. Adam got a ton of footage. You might have been able to pick that up. They just announced Roger Federer. He's playing doubles with Wawrinka. And so, of course, earlier we got a little bit of Federer. We also got some Hewitt, some Soderling, some Del Potro. Adam actually might be filming Roddick right now. And we also, one of the cool things about being media at this tournament is you get to, the media and the players eat in the same cafeteria. So I was actually standing in line right next to Federer today, and it was cool because you get to look at what these guys are eating before a match. And Federer was eating a lot of pasta, so he was loading up on carbs. So that was a cool kind of behind-the-scenes thing we got to check out. Now let's bring it back to strategy, because we learned about directionals, court geometry, court positioning, and SWAT. And what we're going to do in the next video is take those 4 concepts and apply them to a concept called defense neutral offense, or DNO for short. And this is a concept we came up with at FYB to explain the strategies and the tactics the pros are using, and explain them in a way that mere mortals just like you and me, well, we can apply the same strategies and tactics that they are using as well. So stay tuned for that. DNO is absolutely awesome. You're going to love it. And we're going to give you a specific tactic that you can use for beating a pusher, because the pusher is one of those opponents that a lot of rec players struggle with. So we're going to give you a specific tactic you can use to beat a pusher. Now, in closing this video, I'd like to ask you to leave a comment below and answer one of 2 questions. You can certainly answer both if you want to. The first is, are you playing high percentage tennis? Are you using directionals, court positioning to construct points, and again, to play high percentage tennis? And second, are you using SWAT? Are you aware not only what your strengths and your weaknesses are, but why they are strengths and weaknesses? In other words, if your forehand is your strength, it's a strength because it's really consistent. Maybe you have a lot of power. Maybe you place it well. And if your backhand's your weakness, is it a weakness because maybe you don't hit it well on the run, or you don't handle those low balls well, and so on? Are you performing that analysis not only on yourself, but also on the other end of the court, your opponent, because that is equally as important. So looking forward to, please leave those comments below. Looking forward to reading them. And I will, of course, jump in when you guys have questions and comments. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, but I will see you soon in the next video.